everyone, and welcome to today's Ask the Expert session. We're really glad to have you join us. I'm Melissa Craig, the Regional Manager for the Americas region. Corinna, if you could go to the next slide. This month marks Avolution's 20th anniversary. We're proud to say that we have accomplished quite a bit over those years, including being a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant and Forrester Wave, as well as growing to be a part of enterprise architecture practices of many organizations across the world. Today, we have two Abacus experts who are here to answer your questions about technology life cycles, process modeling, and integrations. Manisha Sanasi and Corinna Ahmed are two of Avolution's senior consultants. They've each helped many enterprise architecture teams to advance their practices using Abacus. I hope you've brought your questions for these experts. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Our goal is to answer questions related to each topic at the time each topic is being covered. You can submit your questions in the Q&A module, which is found at the bottom of your screen. We'll remind you each time it's time to submit those questions after we've covered each topic. We did have some previously submitted questions, which is great. So we'll start with those after each topic. And then, of course, we'll move on to the questions that you all submit live. With that, I'll turn it over to Manisha and Corinna.
Thank you, Melissa. So we'll start with technology life cycles. So technology life cycles often play a large role in our overall roadmaps. This is because even though some elements of the architecture may seem isolated, this is rarely true. The technologies are part of an end-to-end ecosystem delivering a particular product or service. And therefore, the technology life cycles will have an impact on linked elements and will perhaps even drive our roadmaps. So how can we assess our technologies? We can start by capturing what technologies are in use in the organization. So over on the left, we can see which application servers, database servers, web servers, and operating systems are in use, and how many systems are using those. We can also see which are approved, superseded, withdrawn, or denied. And our dashboard filtering allows us to drill into these to be able to answer questions such as, what technologies am I using that have been superseded? Or which technologies are retiring on a particular date? You can also use catalog filters to say which platforms are retiring today, or in the next 3 months, or the next year. And this allows us to answer these questions on an ongoing basis and not just at a particular point in time.
One way to incorporate an easy visual is to use a visual algorithm to subtract today's date from the support end date and divide by 365 to get the number of years until retirement. The output from the algorithm, which is displayed in the column chart on the right, allows us to have quick filtering to focus on upcoming support end dates.
We can then put together roadmaps and Gantt charts to show the dependencies between our technologies and applications. So here we can see our application life cycles in blue. Then we can click into those applications and drill down to see the technologies they are relying on with their life cycles in green and red. The goal here is to have up-to-date technologies in place for the duration of your application's life. So if an application is in production for a number of years and is using technologies that are going into or have already gone into their end of support, as we can see here, this could indicate risks or even opportunities to bring in new technologies.
Excellent. So please be sure to enter your questions in that Q&A box that we mentioned related to technology life cycle, excuse me. Again, we will cover the next topic and then provide you an opportunity to ask your questions then as well. So the first question that's been pre-submitted, how can we capture technology life cycle information?
Yeah, good question. So we'll talk later on about our integrations, and one of those integrations is with a product called Technopedia, which is a library of common technologies and their lifecycle information. So actually the good news is that you don't have to do lots and lots of searching for lifecycle information. There are products designed to capture this. And all we want is to bring in a few key dates, such as when the technology will be available, when it will be out of support, and when it will be obsolete, and store them as properties on the technology components. You can then use those properties to produce the charts, such as the Gantt chart that we saw a moment ago.
Great, thanks, Manisha. Next question, how can we report on unsupported technologies to our stakeholders?
Yeah, so the first step would be to capture lists of the technologies in use within your organization. And you can do that using the catalogs. And then the next step is to start to link them to the other objects, such as the applications or servers. And then using the end of support dates that you have captured, you can easily query which technologies are unsupported. And on top of that, you'll be able to see what impacts they will have on the rest of your architecture.
Wonderful. So we've had another question that's come in. Can we see how much out-of-date technologies are costing us?
Yeah, good question. So with your technologies, you might know the cost of purchasing those technologies, but when you want to know actually how much are they costing you in real terms, you might want to attribute those costs together with costs of the underlying infrastructure, or you might even have people required who are experts in those technologies. And you can aggregate all those costs together to give you a total cost of ownership of your technologies. And you'll be able to query right from the top, right from your applications, your processes, you'll be able to see how much are those particular objects costing you and how much can we attribute from the underlying technologies. So that's just using our out-of-the-box cost simulation in Abacus.
Great. Another question related to out-of-the-box things that are available. Someone has asked, are any of these views of life cycles that are preset in the tool out of the box?
Yeah, so there was a diagram that we showed on one of the dashboards earlier. So that is out of the box. That comes with our example project. It also has some information, so the one with the web servers, database servers, operating systems, and it's got all the lifecycle dates associated to it. So you can certainly use that one out of the box. And then some of the dashboards that we showed, the Gantt charts and the various other charts that we showed, they're part of our demo project, our example project, but we can actually provide that to you if you just get in contact with your consultant, they can help to provide that information. But actually it's quite easy and straightforward to set up. So it's quite easy to put those together yourselves as well.
Perfect. And so with the visualizations, particularly the roadmap visualization, someone's asked if they're able to use their own color scheme when creating those.
Yeah, definitely. So you can use whatever color scheme you want. We went with like a light to dark theme, so you can actually customize the colors that you want. I might see if Corinna has a good answer on this one, as I know she has presented previously on dashboards and the color options available.
Yeah, there are a lot of options with setting those colors, and oftentimes it can be helpful to set color schemes where either the color is indicative of the phase of the life cycle, or you have different color schemes sort of per component type to make it easier to read the Gantt chart. So of course, some also prefer to stick to a color scheme that is specific to their company or branding guidelines.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you. We had a couple other questions just come in. So to get this view, I assume we need to have Abacus in sync with their inventory, for example, their CMDB as well. What tools do we have in order to get that?
Yes, a good question. Actually, we'll talk later on about the integration. So we'll talk about the synchronization with CMDB and also with Technopedia and how easy it is actually to bring in this data. So we might just cover that one a little bit later.
That sounds great. How about, someone has asked about how do you envision to identify technology standards and the current status of technology, such as, in operation, deprecated, et cetera. And second part of that question, do you see using different attributes?
Yeah, definitely. So we do just use date properties on the technologies. So we have various different properties. So you can say like when it goes into production, when it's available, the date of when it goes into its end of support, and when it goes obsolete. So actually you can then run like an algorithm to then show you, according to today's date, is it in production, in operation, or is it already obsolete? So yes, certainly you do use different attributes for that.
Perfect. And then is it possible to show a comparison of, future versus current state in a diagram?
Yeah, definitely. We have a few different options for showing future state and current state. So within a diagram, within a Gantt chart, you could certainly show your technologies and the current technologies you're using, the future technologies you're using. You could show those side by side. We do actually have another concept, which is through use of different architectures. So you can have a current state architecture and a future state architecture, and you can start to model what things are going to look like at a particular future date. And then, yes, you can suddenly see those side by side, or you can view the differences either in a catalogue or through diagrams.
Wonderful. So another question's come in. How can we capture technology and business risk in order to make informed business decisions, such as investing in technology or migrating existing technology to a new platform to mitigate risk?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can certainly look at what risks you have associated to those technologies. So a lot of the time we think about, out-of-date technologies being a bit more risky, and those will perhaps even highlight the ones that you need to invest in to perhaps migrate to different technologies or to refresh them. So you can capture the risks associated to your technologies and perhaps then try to roll them up to the other objects that they're connected to. So you'll have your technologies connected to perhaps your applications. Your applications might connect to your processes. So even right from the point of your processes, you might even be able to see which are my risky processes based on the underlying technologies that they're inadvertently connected to.
Wonderful, thank you, very helpful. All right, so I think we can go ahead and move on to the next topic of process modeling.
All right. Thanks, Melissa. So we'll go over a bit about process modeling. Building process models in Abacus can be valuable for understanding the steps in the process, as well as placing the process in the greater context of the enterprise. A key advantage of doing process modeling within enterprise architecture and within an enterprise architecture tool such as Abacus is that the people, applications, data entities, and other related components are part of that same repository. So you can connect to those live parts of the repository from the process components and aspects of the process itself. There are some different ways to approach process modeling. And one way that we can model processes is very simple and is supported in most frameworks. It includes having a basic hierarchy of processes, and in order to show the flow, also connecting these process components with sequence flow connections, as well as relationships to outside components such as departments and applications. So here in this recording, we can see a process being built in this way using the enterprise modeler functionality. I'm just going to skip ahead here a little bit to see a later stage. Here we can see we have start events and we have processes nested under that larger process, and these are being connected together with sequence flows. And then later on, we can add additional connections to outside components such as departments to place all of this in context. The Avolution framework and many other frameworks don't distinguish between tasks and processes immediately. And for the Avolution framework, if you want to incorporate lanes as well as tasks, you can consider importing another meta model. So the way that the Avolution framework incorporates lanes is just using departments and actors as lanes. But by importing the model as shown here, we are importing processes and lanes as their own components, which can make it quite a bit easier for your modelers, whether those are studio modelers or enterprise modelers, it can make a significant difference in making that modeling easier for them. This structure provides strong support for enterprise modelers to model processes, allowing for more federated management of processes. The enterprise modeler can build out the process and the relationships between the process component, lanes, and tasks, as the hierarchical relationships are suggested to the user as they build out the diagram. And that makes it very easy to make sure that all of the pieces and components are connected together. So jumping a little bit ahead here in this recording, we can see how once we've added this new process, and then we can incorporate a pool or lane. And you'll see that while the enterprise modeler is adding in this lane, it's going to actually prompt the user to make it a child of the process, meaning that that connection between the lane and the process is going to be built out just by the natural organization of the diagram. This approach does also allow us to connect to other components in the model. Lanes and/or processes can be connected to the departments, actors, suppliers, and so on that perform them. Processes and/or tasks can also be connected to the applications that they use and the data that they access. And we're seeing that being built out here in this diagram example. So a few tips for enabling enterprise modelers to build processes is to first build all relationships with visible connections or hierarchy. So don't use any float components. Make sure everything is going to be very obviously placed within its hierarchy or built using a connection. Try and use as few connection types and component types as possible in the viewpoint to make it simple and easy. Try and give each component type a distinct shape to make it very obvious what is being selected. And consider keeping hierarchy constraints set to warned, as the enterprise modeler has the potential of violating hierarchy constraints accidentally. Also try to minimize required properties to make the process as smooth as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Corinna. So just a reminder, now's the time to go ahead and place any of your questions in the Q&A box, any questions related to process modeling at this point, and we'll go ahead and cover those. So let's go to our first pre-submitted question. How can I successfully manage my business processes and involve the wider business?
So this is one way where having a more federated model is going to really be useful, particularly if you're able to enable enterprise modelers and make process modeling easy for them. This will allow you to have a lot of contribution outside of the core EA team and successfully manage those business processes by having them managed by users who are closer to the delivery of those processes or of those tasks. So exposing that out to a broad audience and making it accessible and easy are a big part of that. Another big part of it is exposing the output to a broad audience. So making sure that you have dashboards and other means of reporting on the process model as a whole, and that those users are aware of how to go from a big picture process model and drill down into a more granular process model to understand the steps required.
Excellent, thank you, very helpful. So next question, what are the benefits of cloud-based modeling?
So the benefits of cloud-based modeling really come back to the answer from the previous question, where having something that is exposed on the cloud and that does not require the installation of anything makes it easier for a wide range of users to access that information, provide input into it, and also access the output and understand that without having to even necessarily be aware of a new tool that they're accessing. They can instead access something like Abacus Enterprise through a Teams channel or Confluence page, and view those dashboards within the context that they're normally operating in.
Wonderful, great. So we've certainly had a few questions come in, which is wonderful. First one that we'll get to is, can we understand process dependencies to other domains such as data and applications?
Absolutely. So the connections between processes and applications and data entities can be established in a few different places. They can be established as modelers are drawing out a process model. That is an opportunity for them to create connections between the process and the applications the process uses and the data entities it accesses. And of course, that data can also be added in a catalog or tabular type of format. And all of that can be reported on either at that lower granular level of the process model itself, or at a higher, more aggregate level where we might be viewing something like a graph view that we can drill down into, or a partition map that allows us to drill from a high level, perhaps value chain of processes down to those other components which they are dependent on.
Great. We have two questions related to importing and process modeling. So the first one is, how can we import into Abacus documentation of our processes that were already documented within other BPM tools? And the other, which I think will probably have a fairly similar response, is how, if there's a process hierarchy represented in Excel, how can that be imported into Abacus?
Sure. Yeah. So for that, I'll start with the second question first, with the process hierarchy. So if you have a process hierarchy in Excel, that's a great starting point, and that can be imported using what we call round tripping with Excel. Now, for that, when you're importing with hierarchy, you do have to keep in mind the order of the steps. So you have to first import the top level processes, and then the next level of processes with the hierarchy path indicating what its parent is and what the rest of that hierarchy path is. And through this method, you can get all of the different levels of that process value chain into the tool, and that can then be visualized and reported on. Now, when it comes to actual process models that are in other BPMN tools, you can export those to a .bpl format, and Abacus can import those. It might require a little bit of modification once it's imported to make sure it matches your meta model. You might want to consider importing it into a separate architecture. Once you then pull it into your main architecture, if it has a process component around it, or if you put all of that content underneath the process component, you can then fit that higher level process component into the context of that process value chain, if that is something that you also have.
Excellent, great. So next question, when comparing similar processes such as customer service from different companies as a result of an acquisition, can you compare similar tasks, for example, by mapping them to capabilities?
Sure. So for doing something like that, this suggestion of mapping them to capabilities is a great approach. So mapping similar tasks or similar processes to some sort of component that will give an indication of what the high level thing is that is being achieved will help in that comparison. And then one way to compare is just do a side-by-side comparison of the two if you have diagrams. But something that would be probably particularly useful here is having some sort of measurement or KPI that can be calculated on those processes, perhaps using our performance simulator, or perhaps using another type of algorithm to have some sense of how efficient that process is, or comparing the efficiency of those two versions of the process. In order to do that, you can also look at the dependencies that it has. So perhaps one process is more dependent on outdated technology, while another process is less manual, it's more automated, and more dependent on very current technologies. So those are some of the comparisons that you can do and distill into scores.
Great, thank you. So next question is, how can we model a process from a system perspective instead of people? Particularly, how can we model API integrations between different applications as a process?
So in order to model a more system-based process, there are a lot of the same sort of questions as when it's a more people-oriented process, which is how are we going to represent lanes, and how are we going to distinguish tasks and processes and so on. So the first question will be how to represent the different systems and their interfaces and APIs in the process itself, whether you want to have something that is like a lane that is separate from the application, or the application itself with child components underneath it. Both of those are valid options, but that will be one of the first things to figure out. And then you can have components that capture tasks within that interface and have the same sort of flow connections going between them. So it's a lot of the same approaches, but making sure that you're putting it in the context of making sense within the way you're modeling other things within your application portfolio and with your application interfaces.
Excellent, thank you. So with process modeling in Abacus, does it rely on user input only, or are there process mining features that can be plugged into systems?
There are not process mining features, so that might be something that could be considered with integrations, but Abacus does not have a process mining feature as part of it.
Great, thank you. All right, so I think we can go ahead and move on to our next topic, which is integrations. I know we've had some questions come up regarding integrations, so perhaps some of them will be answered during this. Otherwise, we'll try to get to them during the question and answer period for this topic.
Thanks, Melissa. So why do we integrate? Abacus is often used as a single source of truth repository, pulling in data from various external sources into Abacus. And we want to keep this data refreshed and as up to date as possible so that it can be relied upon. We want to avoid duplication and double handling of data, and we want to save ourselves time on manual updates. And we have a few options for how to integrate. So one of the easiest methods is through use of common file formats such as CSV, Excel, Visio. So if the data can be exported into these formats, it can then be imported into Abacus quite easily. Secondly, Abacus has various built-in adapters to ServiceNow, Technopedia, SharePoint, and Google Sheets, and we'll cover these in more detail in the next slides. And lastly, custom adapters can be developed through use of our REST API, which we'll also cover shortly. We mentioned our built-in adapters with ServiceNow and Technopedia. Technopedia provides a library of common technologies and their product lifecycle information, hardware specifications, risk profile and compatibility information, and product pricing information. Our Technopedia sync allows you to look up hardware and software products from the catalog and then import these into your Abacus repository together with various properties, including general availability dates, standard support end dates, and obsolescence dates. These properties can then be used to drive your lifecycle roadmaps, so the ones that we saw earlier on. And also, once imported, the information can be refreshed automatically. The information pulled back from Technopedia may also tie into content that is stored in the CMDB. Abacus has an integration with ServiceNow CMDB, which stores configuration items such as your applications, servers, network elements, and these can be imported into the Abacus repository and kept up to date using the automated sync. And the built-in synchronizations are very straightforward to set up. So for the ServiceNow sync, Step 1 is to just enter in your URL and credentials, which will allow you to connect from Abacus directly to your ServiceNow instance. And step 2 is to begin creating your mappings. ServiceNow stores all of its data within tables. So these tables will align to the component types within Abacus. And then once you have chosen the correct component type to map to the ServiceNow table, it's just a matter of mapping the fields within that table to the properties and connections on the Abacus component type. And you can do all of this within this mapping window here. The most value of bringing these objects into the Abacus repository comes from being able to link them to other objects which are mastered within Abacus. This allows users to do full impact analysis across all layers, including business, applications, information, and technology. And whilst we have various built-in integrations, it is also possible to create your own integrations using our REST API. The Abacus REST API is a two-way API, meaning you're able to read from and write to Abacus. And this will allow data from a huge range of common sources to be exchanged. And it's easier than you may think to create an integration using the REST API. The first stage is to find the endpoints that will give you the data you are after. And you can use tools such as Postman to run your queries. So here we have some example queries. So the first example, we get all the components of the type application in the production architecture. So we're just sending a GET request and it will return us all of those components. The second example, we get all the diagrams created after a particular date. So in this case, we're looking at all the diagrams created after the 1st of October 2021. And in the third example, we send a patch request and we update the description of a specific element. So this time we're pushing data back to Abacus. The REST API uses a standard JSON format, which is commonly used for data exchanges. And it uses OData query syntax, which allows you to limit what data we bring into Abacus. And whilst we can bring in lots and lots of data from third-party tools, such as the CMDB, it's important to limit what we import to only the content that is required for use in Abacus.
Excellent, thank you. So now will be the time to go ahead and post your questions about integrations into the Q&A chat box. I know we've got a couple pre-submitted that we'll go ahead and start with. The first one, how can we create a single source of truth, for example, keeping our data visible with stakeholders and reduce manual updates?
Yeah, good question. So by integrating and bringing your data from various sources into Abacus, you're helping to create that single source of truth repository. And the data doesn't necessarily have to be mastered in Abacus. It can be mastered elsewhere. And unique identifiers are maintained to actually help keep the data in sync. And then this will also remove the need for the manual updates, as the data can be resynced automatically. And with regards to keeping the data visible to your stakeholders, you can present the data back to your stakeholders through our interactive dashboards. And rather than showing a spreadsheet or list of data, they can view charts and interactive visualizations that will help to answer any questions that they have.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I know we do have, I apologize, we had one more pre-submitted. How do we use external data sources and which ones, such as Technopedia, in a recommendation algorithm?
Yeah, good question. So recommendation algorithms are widely used within enterprise architecture for assessments such as assessments of application portfolios or technology portfolios. And if we consider an application portfolio assessment where we're trying to get the overall recommendation, so we have a few different methods. You can capture the 4 Rs, the retain, redesign, refresh, or retire, or the time ratings where you have tolerate, invest, migrate, and eliminate. So you'll want to know for each of your applications or each of your technologies which category they fall into. And in order to do that, you'll want to assess perhaps the business fit and the technical fit of your applications or technologies. So for the technical fit, we might be looking at whether or not the applications are using approved technologies and whether or not those technologies are in support. And for that, you can certainly use the data that comes back from Technopedia.
Excellent, thank you. So we did get a couple of questions regarding whether Abacus has integrations with a couple of other applications. So can you answer whether Abacus has an integration with Signavio or with Microsoft Azure?
Yeah, sure. So Signavio, and I think this question came out during the process modeling. So I believe it is a process modeling tool. So we don't have a direct integration. However, there is a common file format. So I think you should be able to export from Signavio to BPMN, and then Abacus does import a BPMN directly. So you can just try to import an XML file and it should work. And the second one, I think it was Azure. So we don't have an out-of-box integration with Azure. We have worked quite closely with Azure to perhaps capture like the list of the servers being hosted on Azure. So I think it's definitely possible. And I think some of our clients have done similar integrations. In addition, we do have the Azure Shapes library. So for clients wanting to produce diagrams using the Azure Shapes, we've recently released an updated sample with all the Azure Shapes.
Great, that's helpful. Can you add filters to the data being imported through ServiceNow?
Yes, definitely. So in the ServiceNow synchronization window, it does have the option for you to add filters. So when you're choosing your tables, you can choose which fields you want to bring in, and you can actually filter on the fields. So you can certainly add your filters that way, but actually we find in some cases you might also want to do some post-processing. That might be because the data that comes back from ServiceNow might not be in exactly the format that you require it to be in Abacus. So you can write scripts to convert the data afterwards and to perhaps do some further filtering afterwards.
Excellent. So staying on ServiceNow, if you're able to talk through a little bit at a high level of how someone could set up a ServiceNow integration using the standard connector, for example, what are some of the steps?
Yeah, sure. So it is actually really straightforward. So you just need to go to the ServiceNow sync window, and it will guide you through it. So the first step is just to enter in your URL, your credentials. And then the next step, you just choose, you actually have to have the component type set up already in your Abacus model and all the properties that you'll want to populate. So you have to create those beforehand in your meta model. And then when you go to the ServiceNow sync window, you'll be able to map your tables in ServiceNow to your types in Abacus, and you'll be able to map each of the fields to each of the properties that you want. So it is just a mapping exercise. And then once you have all your mappings, you can just save it and import the data. You also have the option to import it automatically on the server. So a lot of our clients tend to import their data from ServiceNow every night. So it just gets refreshed automatically.
Excellent. And so someone has asked, how do they manage the limitation of 500 items returned by API when integrating Abacus with external systems?
Yeah, good question. Yes, so there is a limit of 500 responses. However, if there are more responses, it will give you the link to the next URL. So you should just be able to query the next URL to give you the next set of 500 results.
Great, that's very helpful. And we've got a question about what are some of the most common API integrations that your clients use? Could you talk through a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. So we do actually find that clients tend to want to integrate with other CMDBs. So whilst we have the out-of-the-box one with ServiceNow, there are various other CMDBs out there. So clients will tend to integrate with those. We also find VMware products. I've seen integrations with VMware products and other business intelligence tools. So the good news is you can, because it uses OData, you can just link the data from Abacus into your business intelligence portal. But also remember that you have Abacus Enterprise available. So that doesn't require any REST API integration. It's just a direct connection to the data.
Perfect. So we have someone who is wondering also, we had asked about the Azure integration, but they're wondering about the same type of thing regarding deployments on AWS.
Yeah, so actually, I think the AWS one is perhaps slightly more common. So we do actually have clients who I believe integrate with AWS, again, just to bring back all the different servers that they have hosted on AWS. And actually the answer is going to be exactly the same. We have also recently put together a shapes library for AWS as well as Azure. So if you want to show the different server types and everything that you have within AWS, you can do so on a diagram using the updated shapes.
Perfect. So regarding the Technopedia sync, we have someone who's asked, we have Abacus, but don't have Technopedia included. How can we get this in our package?
Yeah, so it's certainly possible to get Technopedia added. It's just an add-on. It's slightly different to some of the other ones though, because you would have to have the subscription with Technopedia itself. So Technopedia is from the company Flexera. And once you have the subscription to their product, they can give you an API key, which you can just use from our integration, and that will allow you to connect to their repository.
Perfect. And then just to add to that a bit, to purchase the Technopedia sync, you could certainly speak with an Avolution representative. So another question, what is the general industry practice to integrate Abacus with other enterprise data in common reporting platform or visualization tools like Power BI or Tableau?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So there's definitely the possibility to integrate with these other products. And I think the benefit comes from where you already have these products in use within your organization. So it may be that you already have teams using Power BI and Tableau, already presenting dashboards to their stakeholders, and they might just want part of that dashboard to include some data that comes from Abacus. So I have seen clients do that where they, they have an existing dashboard and then they just have part of it which uses the Abacus data. Because of course, if you just wanted to show the Abacus data, you can easily do that using Abacus Enterprise.
Excellent, thank you. So that is all the questions that we have related to integrations. I apologize. We did actually just have one more come in. Let me get to that. And then I think we have a couple others that are not related to the topics covered today that we'll try to get to. So the question that just came in is, are there any plans to have Avolution integrate with other graph visualization tools?
I'm not entirely sure about other graph visualization tools, but we do actually have, through Abacus Enterprise, we do have the graph visualization available. So you are able to put together graph views of your data that's already within Abacus. So I'm not entirely sure of if there are any plans to integrate with other ones, but again, it is possible to set up your own custom integrations.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so Corinna and Manisha, we do have a couple others that weren't necessarily directly related to the topics that we'll try to get to. Someone has asked how to model Archimate diagrams. I know that's kind of maybe a hard one to kind of talk about and kind of a big topic, but are you able to talk through that at all?
Yeah, sure. I think Corinna, if you want to, do you want to answer that one?
Sure, I'll start. So Abacus does have full support for the Archimate framework, which has all of the diagram styles captured as viewpoints so that you can take those viewpoints, you can use the Archimate framework, use those viewpoints and model the diagrams. Because there are so many possible connections that can go between two different components, I do recommend using connector mode in the toolbar rather than dynamic connector to make it a bit easier. But everything is there, fully supporting Archimate diagramming. And Manisha, did you have anything to add for that?
Yeah, that's a great answer. So when people tend to want to do create Archimate diagrams, it's because their audience is familiar with the Archimate notation. And actually, it's probably a good point to mention that you can use any notation with any framework. So even if you're using our Avolution best practice framework, you can incorporate the Archimate notation on top of that. So if your audience is familiar with applications looking a certain way, they'll be able to recreate those diagrams, but you might also have other members of your team, perhaps those who want to see like BPMN style diagrams, and you'll be able to have a mix of both.
Great. So while we're talking about frameworks, we have had someone ask, how does Abacus support TOGAF and SABSA and other security frameworks? Also, how is the cloud security posture mapped and security patterns, blueprints support with the overall enterprise architecture?
Sure. So out of the box, Abacus supports TOGAF and SABSA actually. So you have the sample project for TOGAF out of the box, which has the meta model and various sample content. So you can start to bring in your content into that TOGAF model. And similarly with SABSA, we do have a library for SABSA. So you can incorporate parts of those into your existing EA model if you wanted to. In terms of the other security frameworks, so another popular one at the moment is NIST. So we do have out-of-the-box support for the NIST framework. And actually SABSA and NIST, they both have a sort of capability model, a security capability model. So SABSA has a matrix and NIST has a capability model that you can then use to identify which of those capabilities your organization is fulfilling. And you can also start to look at things like risks and vulnerabilities. So in terms of cloud security, you might want to actually look at the various risks and vulnerabilities associated with the applications that you have. And you can also put into place measures to mitigate against those risks.
Great, that's really helpful. Another question, does Abacus support graphical gap analysis?
Yes, it does. So we certainly do have support for gap analysis. We actually have the concept of multiple architectures in Abacus. So you can create your current state, your future state, all as separate architectures. And then you can start to look at the differences between those. And you can view those differences both within a tabular format, within a catalog, or you can also view them graphically within your diagrams. So certainly you can view some of those those differences graphically. I don't know, Corinne, if you had something to add there.
Yeah, just building off of that, I think that combined with having current and target state, you can also have explicit gap components where in your current state, you're identifying that there is a gap, and then in the target, you can identify how that same gap is then being filled and is no longer a gap. So it's been mitigated. And so on top of having those architecture state comparisons, you can also add in those components to make that comparison a bit more clear cut.
Great. So, as we know, Abacus is a pretty powerful tool and can do a lot. Would you guys say that Abacus is a good tool for knowledge management for the purpose of storing documents like any technology approvals or storing slide decks and other related documents?
I can answer that one. So Abacus is not a tool for storing outside documents. However, this supplemental material can be really useful within the context of enterprise architecture, and that's where the ability to have links included in Abacus can be really useful. You can add in a link as properties, so it's visible in a catalog or directly onto a component in a diagram. And then the audience consuming this information in a catalog or in a diagram on a dashboard can click on that link and go directly to that other resource to have all of that information related to the diagram or the content that they're seeing in Abacus.
Great, very helpful. How can I integrate an architecture review process or procedure or a conformity check or architecture checklist as a quality gate on Abacus?
Yeah, I can perhaps start to answer that one. So it's certainly possible to capture different metrics associated to your architectures. So we have various scripts already available, and some that we just have internally to capture metrics such as the counts of the types of components within each of your architectures, also the counts of the diagrams that have been created, or even things like how well populated the properties are within a particular architecture. So it's about really understanding what you want to query, and then you can start to capture the metrics to answer those questions. And then when you want to present that information, you can actually present it through your dashboard. So you can get an idea on which of your architectures are more complete or most complete, and which of your component types and properties have been completed as well.
Great. So at a high level, are you able to kind of talk a little bit about managing user permissions in Abacus? For example, which types of users they're able to change permissions on and which they're not?
Yeah, sure. So you do have to have the admin permissions to be able to control permissions in Abacus. So once you have the admin permissions, the admin feature enabled, you can then control other users' permissions, and it uses create, read, update, and delete. So you can control permissions right throughout the model, right up through your component types, your connection types, your diagrams, your properties, even your architectures. So almost everywhere you can control what people can see, and also with your dashboards, you can have permissions on your dashboards. In addition to that, I might mention that we are changing the way that permissions work. In the next couple of releases of Abacus, you will see some improvements. So we have a new, in the next version 9, we'll have a new way of managing those permissions. So it just makes it a lot easier to actually assign permissions to your user groups.
Excellent, thank you. That's very helpful. All right, so it seems that's all the questions that we have for our experts today. Thank you so much, Corinna and Manisha. This was very helpful. And thank you so much to all of our attendees. Thanks for joining us today. The recording and the slides will be made available to you in the coming days, so you can refer back to that if you'd like. Thanks everyone so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.